All right, we're in.
Great, wonderful. Well, we're really excited to have everyone join us today. I'm going to say good morning to those on the West Coast and good afternoon to those in the East. I'm Alison Griffin, Senior Vice President with Whiteboard Advisors, and really thrilled to be hosting a conversation today looking back over the last year. How is higher ed putting stimulus funds to work? Excited to have a great panel with us today, but just to set up the conversation and context for how our discussion will flow. Some of you may remember in April of last year, Whiteboard did two things. One, we hosted a conversation about what the pandemic may mean for higher ed and what challenges higher ed might anticipate. And I had also penned a short piece in Forbes and talked about how we might be able to actually leverage federal stimulus funds in innovative ways for higher ed to support students, learners, campuses over the course of the forthcoming months. But now as we approach the 1-year mark of the passage of the CARES Act, which was the initial $2 trillion stimulus bill that kept the American economy afloat in the aftermath of the pandemic, we really wanted to learn about how colleges and universities were making use of their funds. And while the bill included about $14 billion to help cover the costs associated with the delivery of instruction and to provide emergency grants to students, we really wanted to tap in and talk to some higher ed leaders and advocates about how those dollars were actually getting into the hands of students and supporting learners. So today we're going to talk about some of the perhaps more creative and counterintuitive ways that COVID-19 relief funding has helped institutions to navigate a fairly uncertain time and prepare for an equally dynamic future. So joining us today, we have Dr. Tim Rennick, Executive Director of the National Institute for Student Success at Georgia State University. We have Dr. Carrie Hauser, the President and CEO at Colorado Mountain College. Dr. Julie Alexander, Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at Miami-Dade College, and Dr. Will Del Pilar, Vice President at the Education Trust. Thank you all so much for joining our conversation today. And to get us kicked off, I'm actually going to ask just a context-setting question to all of you. We've witnessed an incredible disruption in post-secondary education over the last year. And while Congress has allocated funds to support institutions and students, many argue more resources are needed. Can you talk about how your institution, or Will, in your case with the Education Trust, has leveraged federal pandemic relief funds over the last year to support institutional operations and students? Tim, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for asking me to be here, and thanks for the first question. I think the lesson we've learned over the last 12 months is that the preparation for this pandemic had to begin years earlier. And a lot of the investments in technology and data that Georgia State has been making for the past decade have proven really useful. Well, the clearest example is in our use of CARES Act and subsequent federal aid and getting the money directly to students. One of the charges we got from the federal government and from Congress was to distribute the money as quickly as possible, to get it in the pockets of students, and to distribute it in a way that was appropriate given the needs of students, so not giving everybody the same amount. So we set up two processes last April for the distribution of CARES Act funds. One was a traditional application where students could apply, say, this is my need, this is the money I request, and so forth. But we also knew that that's a really slow and cumbersome process. And more than that, the students who are most empowered will be the ones who tend to get the money through taking the time out to fill out an application and so forth. So we use the data sets that we've been developing for our Panther Retention Grant program over the last decade. These are ways we're identifying students in financial need without them having to raise their hands. And we've been distributing these so-called retention grants ever since 2011. And so we set up a parallel process for distributing federal aid via identification of students who were in financial hardship due to data we were collecting. These are students with unmet need, with holds on their accounts, with large balances and so forth. And what's interesting 12 months later is we've given about 4,000 grants out. via the traditional measure of having a student fill out an application and say, this is what I need, and so forth. That's a very high number for a 12-month period, by far a record for Georgia State. But we've given out over 40,000 grants via identifying students who are in financial need and just putting the money in their accounts, basically saying, we've identified this need, here's the money, you're good to go. We think that proactive approach to distributing CARES Act and then subsequent federal aid has been critical in helping us distribute the money more equitably and also eliminating equity gaps. We went through another year, our 6th year in a row, where we have no equity gaps in graduation rates, at least based on students' race, ethnicity, or income level.
Thank you. Carrie, would you mind talking a little bit about Colorado Mountain College and how you all have leveraged those funds in support of students?
Sure. Thanks, Allison and Whiteboard, for convening us today. And I won't repeat some of what Tim mentioned, because sort of those mechanics, I think we all worked really hard to get funding into students' hands. I think the way that I would describe our leveraging of the stimulus dollars was as much about messaging and is about keeping students on track. So we, and probably as my colleagues experienced as well, we were all flying the plane as we were sort of pounding those wings on. And that included guidance from the Department of Education in terms of how we could use those funds. So before we got full clarity about that, we decided to go. Our board is an elected board, and we decided the best thing that we could do was to indicate that we were reinvesting in our local communities, whether or not the stimulus dollars qualified or not. We had some sense that somewhere in the whole sausage making process, we would be able to leverage those funds and to have them benefit the institution, but we weren't quite sure. So we said we're going to go. And what's important context for us in Colorado, in different parts of the country, there were different sort of those big milestones that we will all remember forever. But for us in our mountain region, so Colorado Mountain College is a multi-campus local district college. We're funded predominantly by local property tax from the mountain resort communities of Colorado. So a lot of the ski area resort communities that many of you are familiar with. Vail, Steamboat Springs, Breckenridge, Aspen. And on March 14th, all of the ski resorts shut down, literally overnight. And so that was the big punch in the gut that we all felt. Clearly, we knew all this was coming. But for us, all of the economies downstream, as I have in my photo, all those economies downstream from those major ski resorts, all the sort of tangential economies, hospitality, everything that goes with these mountain communities, it was an incredibly acute moment. And so we thought we don't have time to determine sort of what's going to happen and what the rules and the guidance around these stimulus funds will be, but we're going to act anyway, with the notion that we have an opportunity to storytell. We have an opportunity to inject some urgency, obviously, in our mountain communities. And as people were immediately out of work, we could sort of lean in and say, what could we do? And so what we tried to do, we stood up something, and I'll put it in the chat, called CMC Responds. It had a whole number of components, and institutions across the country did different kind of aspects of this. But for us, we needed to try to keep people in these mountain communities from leaving, because so many of our students are part of this ecosystem. They're either the ski patrollers, or they work in our hospitality industry. They're part of this whole ecosystem. And so what we really wanted to do was to try to keep them in these mountain communities rather than leaving to either big urban areas or wherever they might go. And so we essentially said summer tuition is free. There will be no cost for summer tuition in 2020. Most of that, as we all know, is an online virtual environment. But essentially, we wanted to give students an opportunity to continue on their path. if they had started a program with us, and for us, it's anything from a certificate, associate to a bachelor's degree. If they had started with us, we wanted them to continue. If they'd never started a program, we wanted them to come and enroll with us if they were one of our local students. And again, we had very few exceptions to students that qualified. If you were disrupted, if your life was upended by the pandemic, if you were part of this sort of mountain resort ecosystem, you could come and enroll at CMC for no cost for those summer courses. And it worked. So students took far more courses, they took far more credits. We are actually, as part of what we think is an outcome of this and a number of other steps that we took, we are actually on pace to graduate the largest class we've ever had at the institution. And we think that some of that was that students took more classes, they were able to sort of jumpstart or really invest in their education because they didn't have the other time commitments that obviously they would have had if they were continuing to work. So that was partly what we did. And again, ultimately, we weren't able to use directly the stimulus dollars for that. But our board said, okay, we're not traveling. The institution has savings. We have an opportunity to essentially kind of match what's coming in to support our students in room and board refunds and all the things that we were allowed to use. And we just said, we're going to do this. It's good for our local economies. It's good for us because obviously we're supported by local property tax. The more that we can do to support our economy recovering is actually good for us. So it's very much a sort of a holistic ecosystem. So there were other components of CMC Responds, which I will be glad to put in the chat and certainly happy to answer questions.
That's great. No, thank you for that overview. And I think that it actually tells a story that perhaps is a little different than what we've read, particularly in the 2-year credentialing sector, which is the significant decline in enrollments. And it sounds like CMC, with the program that you have put in place, you've actually seen that increase. And so I'd like to just shift quickly over to you, Julie. I know being at Miami-Dade College, I imagine that you've experienced some of the same challenges that Tim and Carrie have both articulated, but would love to hear how Miami-Dade was able to leverage the CARES dollars initially, and perhaps some of the changes that you've seen on campus over the last year.
Sure. I'll say ditto. A lot of what Tim and Carrie have mentioned, we also implemented. There was a lot of the CARES Act shuffle that we went through as well. And just before sort of going into some of what we used the CARES Act funds for, a little bit of context about Miami-Dade College. We have over 100,000 students. We have 8 campuses. 90% of our students are underrepresented, about 75% Hispanic, 60% low income, and about 50% non-native English speakers. So just provide that as a context because this was for all of higher education a challenging time. And for many institutions, including Miami-Dade College, it was particularly difficult in terms of impacts and beyond, the academic endeavors. And I think that that's a key point that, in these kinds of conversations, we have to keep mentioning that, life for all of us, what has been hard. Life for individuals that already have hard lives is that much more difficult. So in addition to supporting the students through tuition, we used federal dollars, but we also brought to bear institutional dollars. We had donors that really came to our doorsteps without us knocking on their doors. And it was pretty remarkable in the late spring, early summer, the number of community members that came and wanted to help the students. We really did focus a lot on the instructional supports, both faculty and students. So we, in the spring, that March, paused our instruction for 2 weeks. And just as a note, the bulk of our classes were taught in person that spring originally. And we brought on instructional design consultants. We leveraged third-party faculty development in online learning, like AQ and Quality Matters. Technology. So over 3,000 laptops were distributed to students. We outfitted the faculty with all of the hardware that they needed for remote learning. We boosted up our LMS help desk, our 24, we brought on 24/7 help desk support. We added proctored assessment capacity, and there's a lot to be said about proctored assessments during this time. Lab software for sciences and health sciences. So a lot in the ed tech arena, and mostly to support the faculty in delivering remote instruction to the students.
Sure. I think, but across the three of you, there are definitely some lessons that colleagues can learn from what your institutions really did well in support of learners and in support of your campus community. Will, I want to turn to you because you and I have had a couple of conversations in the context of the student experience, and understand that there are learners who have had difficulty accessing federal funds that have been allocated to their institutions or have been made available for their use. And so I'd be curious to know, what has EdTrust learned over the last year with regards to how students have been able to access those funds, particularly to cover some of their most basic needs?
I'm happy to jump into that, but I did want to kind of go back to the first question and say, I think it's really commendable what institutions on this call have done, but these approaches and these solutions haven't been universal. They're specific to these institutions. And I can't stress, I believe that there should be limited additional support without agreement for additional accountability. Cohort default rate is not a sufficient response for institutional accountability. And if federal government is going to be investing dollars, we should know who these interventions are working for and who they're not working for. And I think that, that's a part of the conversation we need to be having. When we talk about, the institutional aid that's been distributed, what I would first say is that the truth is we don't know how or if students at institutions have been able to access funds. Federal dollars largely went to institutions, and there hasn't been a data collection or any reporting on how dollars were allocated, what the average grant was, how institutions decided who was eligible, minus the guidance or lack of guidance from the Department of Education. There also wasn't any standardization on how students could get access to dollars. Some institutions had, we just heard Tim mention they had an application initially. Other institutions required an application and an interview. Others distributed it equally to all students. Some distributed it to students who were Pell eligible. And so there wasn't a universal approach to distribution of these dollars. What I would say is that, there are a couple of ways to ensure that students are getting access to these funds. One, the Fed could distribute dollars to State Department of Higher Ed and implement greater reporting requirements disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and Pell status. The Fed could require the same reporting requirements and maintain the institutional distribution approach. And the Fed could mandate a period by which institutions must distribute dollars, or else they can require institutions to return unspent dollars to students, unspent dollars, and provide the amount spent, the actual amount spent by institutions and any future stimulus packages. And so the truth is we don't know. It's a great black box. We don't know who got dollars. We don't know what differences were. We don't know what the average grants were because we don't have any data to this point to, effectively let us know if these actually are working and who they're working for and who they're not working for, most importantly.
Sure. Well, I'd certainly love to have our colleagues around this virtual table respond to any of those ideas. But in short, it sounds like, whether it was the response or accountability conceived by the prior administration and perhaps the transition to a new administration, we've sort of lost the, I'd say, the consistency across implementation of some of these initiatives. And so I guess I'd be curious to hear from Tim and Julie and Carrie, just your thoughts on what Will has laid out, and perhaps the direction that we could go in the future with respect to knowing who's actually receiving the funds and if their needs are being met.
Yeah, I'll mention that I think one advantage of the lack of guidance, and there was, as you've heard from several of the panelists already, there was quite a bit of confusion. In fact, there was shifting in the first few weeks about the guidelines we were getting from Department of Education, and they were trying to interpret the congressional intent and so forth. So that was less than ideal, but the fact that we were not told this is specifically how to award a grant, this is the amount you should give to this student versus that, did allow us to leverage some of the nuances we have for our own data systems. And we think that served our students well. So while I do understand what Will is saying about the fact that right now, the distribution of these monies were all over the map, there may have been benefits to not trying to legislate it too closely, especially as we were first entering the pandemic.
And I would add that it's tricky because I would hesitate to be critical of the gesture and what I think was the intent, obviously, of these funds and these programs. And certainly, I think we all agree that supporting students was the first priority. And at the same time, our institutions being somewhat handcuffed to actually deliver the programs and the additional support that students needed, whether that's internet access or food insecurity and so many of the other issues that came up. While you can certainly get dollars into the hands of students, the fact that so much of it was limited to backfill and to support institutional operations was challenging. And I understand it on its face. I do think that we probably could have provided additional levels of accountability if those had been some of the guidelines, and in any, if we see sort of, when we see chapter 3 of this, I hope there's some lessons that have been learned that anyone that's creating those guidelines isn't thinking, well, we're just sending money to, quote, wealthy resourced institutions. I think, I look at, my colleague from Miami-Dade, it's one of the largest institutions in the country and is supporting so many students. We've got to be able to put into place additional supports for them to remain in the pipeline and obviously to come out of this on the other end as the economy recovers. So those are some of my reactions. It's, you don't want to sort of greet a gift horse in the mouth with criticism. And I do think if we were to go back with the absolute benefit of hindsight, we probably had some of the mechanisms to support our students directly if we'd had more flexibility on the front end to utilize those funds. And we could have, and/or there could have been accountability measures where I think we could have shown and demonstrated how we use those funds and what the results were.
I appreciate that, that comment, Carrie. And actually one of the points that Will just made and you gently touched on, but I'd like to come back to you with a question. As some on this webinar might know, Governor Polis was actually one of the only governors who used the federal funds intended for education that went to governors to instead create an innovation grant fund. In Colorado, it was known as the RISE Fund, or the Response, Innovation, and Student Equity Education Fund. And it was established to support high needs school districts, schools, higher ed institutions. And I know that Colorado Mountain College had received a RISE Fund grant. Can you talk a little bit more about how just maybe in general terms, how that initiative worked, and then what CMC is doing to leverage those dollars in the spirit of supporting students and innovation?
Sure. So I again put in the chat for future reference if Whiteboard wants to make that link available to folks. So, you know, our governor opted to park a component of the funds that came directly into the state to serve particularly rural parts of our state, and emphasized partnerships with high schools, with local communities. It was very much an economic sort of recovery gesture to institutions that could demonstrate partnerships. So in our case, there were two rounds of the RISE grant funding, and we ended up with the largest grant in round 2, and partnered with a community college in the northwest part of the state of Colorado, which is sort of not done, you know, commonly. Again, I think not letting good crises go to waste in this pandemic environment, it really provoked all of us to think a little bit differently. So we partnered with Colorado Northwest Community College, which is really serves the most rural northwest part of the state of Colorado, and combined with the area that Colorado Mountain College serves, we essentially are covering a quarter of the entire state of Colorado and the most rural, hard to reach parts of the state, and win in on this grant together. And so, you know, for us, you know, $3 million grant is, you know, pretty significant, particularly when its target and its goal is to stand up better technology and bring back concurrent and dual enrollment opportunities for students. I mean, I think we probably have all seen, just given the chaos that's happened with our school districts and our high schools, that concurrent and dual enrollment programs have slid back in terms of enrollment. And so this again was a sort of to be a shot in the arm, to stand up sort of smart classrooms in very rural parts of our state so that students could come back even while they were still in high school, get a bite of that kind of college apple. It's equivalent essentially to, in our case, this will serve 54 high schools in 17 school districts, and will be equivalent to roughly $50,000 to $60,000 per high school to, again, invest very advanced high technology, with the idea that students can really, and you know, it's all the lessons we've learned in this pandemic, right? Now that we have even additional capabilities to deliver programs in a virtual environment, a lot of our rural schools didn't have the ability to turn the switch on and make those classes available. So that's how we're utilizing the funds. Really pleased to be able to do it with a cousin institution in our state, and to really serve this very rural, remote, in many cases, really rural and remote part of Colorado.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing some of the details about that program. I've been following the RISE Fund directly, just because I think it's such an innovative use of those dollars flowing to states. I want to circle back on the conversation around technology a little bit. I think, you know, we all know that some of the CARES Act funds were able to be leveraged to support technology and infrastructure needs. I'm specifically curious, Julie and Tim, perhaps you can talk both about how your institutions have used those resources to support retention and persistence, you know, with the added dollars toward technology capacity. Julie, Tim?
I'll start. So we have used that first round of dollars to infuse our technology infrastructure. And there are just a couple of things that I'll share as examples, and particularly as it relates to student engagement, knowing that the bulk of our students really were coming to campus most of the time, and knowing that they were then going to be not having access to the campus services and that direct access to their faculty. We knew that we were going to have to do to support the faculty in trying to leverage technology to engage the students. And so we had been looking at different technologies, and of course we have a toolkit of ed tech that faculty leverage in their online classes and their blended and hybrid classes. But one particular that we brought on during the pandemic, we had initially started talking with PackBack, but then we brought them in during the pandemic. And PackBack is a tool that fits within the LMS, the learning management system, and really is intended to augment discussion boards and using artificial intelligence. And what we have, so it's only been in place for a few faculty, and about, I would say, 30 faculty, and they've been using it pretty consistently for the past several semesters. What we are seeing through the use of this AI technology, discussion board technology, is that it really has brought students into the class a lot faster and felt a lot more comfortable in this remote setting than they maybe would have even been in in-person classes. And so that's been one technology that we see very much promise beyond the pandemic, but during the pandemic, it's been really pivotal in engaging the students and ensuring that they aren't video off and lost, but they're engaged in the class discussion. Another thing that I'm sure a lot of institutions have done is ramped up their tutoring and their online tutoring services. We had a relationship with a third-party online tutoring service, and we ramped up the hours available. They have definitely been needed and been used to augment our internal tutoring capacities. The whole tutoring infrastructure at the college pivoted, just like everyone else, really quickly to a remote setting, and having this external resource available for their students has been very, very important. There are a number of technologies that we've brought on, and I'll talk a little bit more about one that really helped us through the pandemic in a pretty monumental way in a little bit.
Okay.
That's
great. Thank you, Tim. I know. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll mention a couple of the technologies that have been really useful during the last 12 months. We do use predictive analytics, so we've been known for using predictive analytics to try to proactively identify students who may be struggling and reach out to them. That has increased immensely over the last 12 months. When we pivoted to online classes last late March, we added some new tracking indices that we were looking at, early alerts. So we've been looking at logons to online classes. We've been looking at both the frequency and the intensity of those logons. You know, it's one thing for a student to log on to the class for 5 minutes. It's another thing for a student to be logged on for 50 minutes. And what we didn't do it for a punitive reason. We did it so that we could reach out to the students to figure out what's going on. And so what we've been doing every day is tracking those logons and having academic advisors reach out to the students, either via email, text, or in many cases to call them up directly. That's been really helpful because it's revealed to us where the students were most hurting. A lot of the time the students were struggling academically, but you won't be surprised to know that oftentimes that wasn't the problem. They weren't logging on because they were facing financial issues or emotional stresses and so forth. We basically doubled the number of counseling sessions we've delivered to students one-on-one over the past 12 months, in part because we've been identifying these problems early on. Another technology tool that's been really helpful and deployed repeatedly by Georgia State is our use of an AI-enhanced chatbot. We've had a chatbot for about 5 years, but we've never deployed it in quite the way and extent we've had over the last 12 months. It's been the leading communication tool with students. So when we needed to find out which students could safely leave campus and leave university housing last spring, and which students had to stay with us because they didn't have a safe place to go, we tried sending an email. We got about a 14% response rate. We also sent a text via the chatbot, and within 10 minutes had heard back from 2,000 students about their actual plans for whether they were staying or leaving. All through the summer, we were talking to our students en masse via the chatbot about their preferences for fall. We pivoted the percentage of courses we delivered in certain modalities based upon student feedback about what they were comfortable with and what their plans were relative to coming to campus versus exclusively online classes and so forth. So these tools that were introduced a few years ago as being able to serve a subset of our population now really were deployed to serve the student body overall. And I think that was really critical in keeping us apace of what the students were thinking and needing.
Also, I want to jump in with a quick comment. I think that what these institutions have done is commendable, but we do also have to recognize that not all institutions have access to the same resources. You know, I've talked to students who were at institutions that were using an open version of Zoom, then would all get logged off after 40 minutes, and then they'd all have to log back in. So not all institutions have the same resources. And additionally, not all students have the same access to broadband or even devices. And so while, you know, we can move online and we can provide all of this tech, if you don't have broadband access at home, or if you don't have a device, how do you connect to these courses? And, you know, finally, I'll say, I think that text is important, but what Tim mentions at the end there during his comments is equally important, that greater access to mental health services, I think, is critical during this time when so many people are experiencing stress.
Those are, yeah, all key points to remember. And I am curious, maybe picking up on the access to broadband and technology in order for students to, one, get access to their courses and their classes, but two, to get access to additional student supports. Are any of you willing to comment on how your institutions either leveraged CARES Act funds or were able to make those resources available to students who may not have otherwise had that access?
Sure. And I'm sure my colleagues have other examples, but definitely for the internet access early on in the spring and the summer and the fall and now has been a key part of our strategy. Thankfully, some of the biggest internet providers in the spring, summer through the fall we're offering discounted or free internet for the community and for students. So we certainly connected our students with those free resources. We are also partnering with some of the biggest internet providers to provide discounts to the students. We also brought on a lot more in terms of hotspots where students can check out the mobile hotspots. We have ramped up access on the campuses Some institutions have had, publicized that their parking lots are open for business in terms of internet access, mobile access. And so there's a lot that we've done. There is certainly, to Will's point, a long way to go into ensuring that students have adequate access to internet, for sure. And the mental health counseling is also something that we have ramped up. Online mental health counseling, third-party mental health counseling. What we've found, though, is that some students are hesitant to leverage those resources for a lot of reasons, and one being the stigma associated. And so that's something that we're trying to work through communications and provide students with sort of awareness building, or that everyone really is having a challenging time through this pandemic.
On that last point, I'll mention that we've actually had record numbers of students show up for group counseling sessions. We have on an annual basis sessions for students with eating disorders or recovering addicts and so forth. We've actually increased the enrollment, we think, because the stigma has been reduced. Rather than having to, kind of show up in a room physically, you're instead popping up on a group screen and so forth. So in that sense, it's been a kind of a bright spot that some of those counseling sessions, and we're hearing from the counselors, have actually perhaps worked even better than they might face-to-face. But I share Julie's points about the struggles with the technology. We're doing the hotspots, we're doing loaner laptops and iPads and so forth. I think both Miami and Atlanta have advantages here because we don't have dead zones as far as coverage is concerned. So if we can get students these devices, they can usually find a place to get access. The picture may be very different for Carrie and her students, where there might be places where if they're living remotely and away from campus, they really do have trouble finding any way to get access to Wi-Fi.
And I do think it's important. I would just jump in and say it's not just our students. I mean, we really found that our faculty and staff struggled with this. And so, we actually went in and provided a remote working stipend. We realized very quickly that, with everyone working from home, they were either having to, go out for better plans. They were having to upgrade. I mean, by no fault of their own. I mean, hopefully it's a long-term good benefit for folks, but it wasn't just our students that didn't have access in some cases. I mean, where you really have people that are living in remote parts of the state. I mean, in our case, we have some of the highest cost mountain resort communities anywhere, Aspen, Vail, some of these places. And a lot of those, that sort of service and work in these industries, are living 60 miles away, taking public transit. I mean, it really is a tale of two situations here. So we also had to really stand up support for our employees to be able to deliver courses and programs to our students. So it wasn't just a challenge for our students.
Such a good reminder, Carrie, the support needed for faculty and staff beyond our student community. So thank you for sharing what you're doing. I'm going to turn quickly to the Q&A. I know there's a question there for Will, and would encourage those of you on the line to put your questions into the Q&A. I certainly have a number that I still want to ask our panelists, but I also want to make sure that your questions are received. So Will, there's a question for you. As you had talked a little earlier about emergency grants and emergency aid, do you know, or maybe Ed Trust is doing this work, about any institutions or organizations that are collecting data on emergency aid distribution?
There was a requirement in the law that institutions submit data by a certain point. That data hasn't been made public yet. And so we actually no one has seen it. And so we're all really curious, like, what have governors done with gear funding? How did institutional dollars get distributed? And so while there were some additional reporting requirements, no one has really seen that data yet on how institutions spent those dollars or didn't spend those dollars. The other thing I would say is, a lot of us are dependent on iPads data, and sadly, iPads has a delay. And so we may not know for 2 years what happened with, student populations that we care about because of the reporting delay in iPads that, kind of puts us behind. So at that point, it might be too late to really try and address some of the student losses that we're probably seeing in higher ed, given the National Student Clearinghouse reports that we've been seeing on decreases in enrollment by race, ethnicity, by sector. And so I would say that, we're all waiting anxiously for some of that federal data to be made available, but sadly, we don't have access to it.
Thank you for answering that question. While we wait for other questions to come in, I'm going to pivot just a quick second. We've been talking a fair amount about students and the need for financial support. I think one of the things that we've also started to see is the need for continuous upskilling and reskilling, certainly as not just our 18 to 22-year-old students, but perhaps our adult learners are being displaced or dislocated through their career opportunities. So what could we do in this moment to ensure that we start to think differently about education, training, and hiring, and what might look different going into the next year or 5 years about how our institutions are meeting workforce needs?
I'll start, if you don't mind. And I'll say that I think, before COVID-19, it has been becoming quite clear that institutions of higher education need to be more flexible in terms of what we're recognizing on the front end as far as what students are bringing to the college in terms of knowledge and skills, and being flexible enough to recognize that and to quantify it in terms of applying credits towards a program of study. So prior learning assessment, I think, is a way that we need to recognize that there's a lot of learning that's happening outside of the classroom in the workplace. There are a lot of non-traditional education training providers that are now very much big players in the training space. And we really need to be able to recognize that in terms of getting students on a pathway, on an academic pathway. We also need to build stackable credentials that allow students to sort of put their toe in the water and get upskilled or retrained quickly, get a job. And then if so desired, they come back and they don't miss a beat in terms of their academic progression and build on that credential and add more and more up to the baccalaureate degree. So looking at the pathways from continuing education, the non-credit side to the credit side, really just being more flexible and recognizing that learning is happening all over the place and not just in a college credit classroom.
That's an incredible reminder. Tim, you're about to jump in.
Yeah, I'll be a little less positive with one observation. I agree completely with what Julie was just saying, but there have been added challenges and obstacles to performing and pulling off some of these programs over the last 12 months. I mean, we like Miami-Dade, our minority serving institution, about 75% of our students are non-white, about 60% are low income. And we've been working very hard in recent years. In fact, it's one of our highest priorities to get our students more professional experiences earlier on in their academic careers. The challenge over the last 12 months is a lot of those experiences were the first thing to dry up, right? The internship programs, work opportunities, all these kind of partnerships we've been working so hard to build. It was almost immediate after things began to close down last spring. No, we're not going to do that. And so we've had a year of students not having those kind of professionalizing experiences, which really do in many ways help to level the playing field a bit, between them, the students who may not have a deep background in work history coming into college and those who do. So this is something we need to pay some attention to as we begin to hopefully get back to normalcy, is recognize that that's going to be more important than ever, and that we've got a group of students who have kind of fallen behind with regard not just to internships, but all the kind of professional experiences that are so important for people to have to be equipped to, kind of take it to the next stage.
Absolutely. That's a great reminder. Thank you for both jumping in on that question. I'm going to actually turn back to the Q&A, and I think there's a question from Bruce Vandal that may have grown out of the question that we had put over to Will, but is specific to Colorado. So Carrie, I'm going to ask this of you. Do you know if RISE Fund recipients will be submitting data to the Colorado Department of Higher Ed on the impact of their grants on student outcomes? Or do you know if there is a mechanism to push for the scale of some of those most effective innovations that come out of that program?
And thanks for the question, Bruce. Certainly recognize your name. Well, the answer would be, I certainly hope so. I think similar to, the U.S. Department of Education. I mean, I think getting these funds out was really important. If I know our governor, certainly there will be an interest in scaling. There will certainly be an interest in understanding how these investments worked. So whether or not it's required, which I have a hard time believing it's not, those grants were recently announced. I suspect those details will be forthcoming. We certainly will do that just by virtue of kind of our own interest in making sure that we monitor those. I mean, I think maybe it's a little bit of a tangent to the question, but getting the grant is one thing, actually implementing it is an entirely, we all know that, right? How we actually get it done is secondary. And in our case, standing up and investing in technology in rural parts of our state. I mean, some of the other panelists may chime in and agree or disagree with me, but we've had trouble actually getting the equipment, given sort of the state of the pandemic and tariffs and sort of all the things that we kind of walked into initially. And everybody, obviously it's, this is a supply and demand question. All of us are demanding that we get these technologies and this equipment. That's been a challenge as well. So it'll be interesting. I anticipate, just based on kind of who's working on these grants in our state, that we'll have an opportunity for it to be somewhat of an iterative process, and we will make sure that we're accountable for those funds.
Great. Thank you, Carrie, for taking the question. And I see, actually, there's a response from Brenda in the chat to the panelists. I'll make sure that everyone sees this, but Brenda had noted that there will be a formal third-party evaluation of some of the RISE grant funds, but really unclear what that looks like going forward. So thanks for the question. I'm going to turn to Steve's question in the chat. Steve asked, those of you who have been following what's going on in Washington know that we also just passed the American Rescue Plan. And so what all have you learned from an institutional standpoint, certainly Will, from the work that Ed Trust has been doing, how CARES Act funds were used that you might apply to the use of American Rescue Plan funds? Lessons learned.
Well, one thing we've learned over the last 12 months is the students who have been hit the hardest, at least from an academic perspective. Interestingly, what we saw as a fall and now spring semester have unfolded is that our juniors and seniors have done very well. They've already kind of acclimated to college. Their grades are fine. They're accumulating the right number of credit hours. We've had trouble with our incoming first-year students, the students who were starting college last fall. We had large increases in the courses that were dropped. We had large increases in the number of students getting failing grades, non-passing grades in these courses. So one thing we've done to pivot as the new federal stimulus money is coming in is directing monies directly to try to solve that particular issue. We'll have a summer program this summer called the Accelerator Program, where first-year students who failed some of these essential classes in English and math and so forth that they need to keep pace with their studies can come back, basically take the courses for free, but we have wraparound services for the students. All the sections will have supplemental instruction, we'll have tutoring, we'll have academic advising and so forth to try to get these students caught up for the classes that they didn't succeed in this past academic year. If we don't try to address that problem quickly, they're going to be not only behind for the whole rest of their academic careers, but a number of these students are going to be dropping out because they will run out of resources before they complete their programs.
I'm happy to jump in with just a couple, just really quick thoughts. One, when we think about broadband support and broadband access for low-income students and rural students, we shouldn't just provide access during a pandemic, but we need to think about how we continue to provide access beyond current funding. I think in today, like schooling today, broadband access is not a nice to have, it's a must have. Additionally, I would say that, we know that food insecurity was an issue before the pandemic and will continue to be after the pandemic. And we know that, there have been some, the pandemic EBT for students has been expanded. Sadly, only 31 states have been approved. And I just wonder, are students in these other states that haven't submitted or haven't gotten approved, are there students in those states not hungry? And so I think I'd like to see every state take advantage of that beyond September 2021 when that expires, and open up access to pandemic or EBT for students who are eligible.
And can you, Will, just quickly for everyone in the audience, you said it's, what's the program?
The pandemic EBT, so basically, access to food, dollars for food from the federal government for students.
Okay, good. Thank you for raising those additional points. So the one last question in the chat, and then I'm going to round out with hopefully end on a high note. Outside of the recent emergency funding, what can the federal government or policymakers more broadly, maybe even at the state level, do to support institutions going forward? If you had your magic wand wish list, what would be the thing that would be on it?
Well, I might pick up a little bit on some of Will's comments and say, certainly an increase in Pell Grant amounts and some index that continues to keep that purchase power in current time would be helpful. But I would say even more so than that, it's flexibility on the use of financial aid. I mean, again, I started by sharing our experience with CMC Responds. The ability for students to really extend financial aid over the course of a year for shorter courses. Again, our financial aid policies haven't caught up with our ability or interest in trying to innovate and get students through their courses or their programs faster and at times that work for them. And I think we've learned obviously from this pandemic that 2 15-week semesters or sort of, kind of these schedules that have been in place for decades of if not centuries in some cases, really need modification. And if financial aid and support for students could catch up to those, I think we would see completion and success increase as well.
I totally agree. Totally agree with that, Carrie. I would say from picking up from Will's earlier comments on accountability, I think that we all understand that accountability is important. And if asked, Miami-Dade College can provide the numbers, the data related to the CARES Act funding. But I would say, in addition to the flexibility around the financial drivers, also flexibilities in policy and infrastructure. We really need to capitalize in a lot of ways on what the pandemic has forced us to do in terms of instruction, in terms of teaching and learning, and not be hamstrung by some of the policy infrastructure that really keeps us from maximizing what we've learned from this past year. And so I think flexibility is the key.
Thank you. I'm going to actually, Tim and Will, I'm going to turn to you. We're going to let this sort of be the silver lining response. So what, for both of you, in addition, what could the federal government or policymakers do in support of institutions going forward?
Well, let me build on the last couple of comments about federal aid and flexibility and so forth by giving a very specific policy example. I fear that we're going to face a problem over the next 12 months with students falling out of compliance for eligibility for their federal aid because their progress has been slowed down, because they've dropped and withdrawn from more classes. The current rules, so-called SAP rules, satisfactory academic progress rules, need to be adjusted to speak for the fact that business is not as usual and students can't be expected to have performed the same way during a pandemic. If we don't adjust that policy, what we're going to be doing is finding even more students, especially from low income and underserved backgrounds, walking away from higher ed because they're going to be barred from their Pell Grants, their loans, and so forth.
Excellent reminder.
Can I just say we focus a lot on the federal response, but I think there's a state role to be played here too. And so states also need to be investing. You know, states like, for example, Georgia, and I know Tim has nothing to do with it, could invest in need-based aid instead of merit-based aid like the Georgia Hope Scholarship or Bright Futures in Florida. So if we really care about the students who need the most resources, we could actually do something at the state level and change investments in merit-based programs to need-based programs.
I think you've teed us up nicely for a future conversation, all of you, with what we could be doing looking forward. And that's really where I'd like to end today. And thank you all for the commitment that you've made, not just to your students, but to your communities and more broadly to post-secondary education in the country. So thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise. Really great to be with you all this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Very good. Take care.
Thank you.